Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. I had been living in that double-wide trailer on the outskirts of Denell for about 3 months when everything went to hell. My 2 kids, Kayla, 9, and Brandon, 12, and I had moved there after my divorce became official. The place sat on about 40 acres of leased land, surrounded by nothing but cotton fields and a few scattered clusters of pine trees. The owner, it's Mr. Hutchinson, practically begged us to agree to stay after the previous family vanished without a trace. $400 a month for a 3-bedroom mobile home felt like a blessing at the time. Hutchinson was an older man, weathered by the years, who always wore the same faded overalls and spoke in short phrases, as if every word cost him money. That Thursday in August started with suffocating heat, the kind of day when the air turns thick like molasses, and even the grasshoppers seem too tired to jump. I remember getting home around 4:30 in the afternoon, after my shift at the turkey processing plant. I was still wearing my uniform soaked with the smell of raw meat and industrial disinfectant. The kids were already inside. Brandon was playing a zombie video game on his Xbox, while Kayla was drawing horses in her notebook at the kitchen table. That summer, she had gotten incredibly good at drawing. She had filled notebook after notebooks with sketches of Arabian horses and wild mustangs. The living room air conditioner struggled against the heat, making a terrible noise every few minutes. I always said I needed to fix it, but there was never any extra money. Around 6, I noticed the light outside had changed to a greenish-yellow shade, like the sky was bruised. From the kitchen window, I could see the cotton plants bending almost completely under the wind, their white bowls moving like popcorn in a hot pan. I checked the forecast on my phone, but it didn't show anything out of the ordinary, just typical August storms expected for that night. I started making dinner. Boxed mac and cheese with sliced hot dogs, while the kids argued about who had to set the table. The first thunder came just as I was draining the pasta, a long, deep roar, like the distant screech of a freight train braking. By 7:30, the wind had become unbelievably powerful. The trailer creaked and groaned in ways I had never heard before, and we had already been through several storms since we got there. The lights flickered a couple of times before going out completely. I grabbed the flashlight I kept under the sink and told the kids not to move while I checked the fuse box. That's when I heard it, a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like we were inside a jet engine. Kayla started crying, and Brandon's face turned pale in the flashlight's trembling beam. The entire trailer shook violently. Dishes clinked inside the cabinets, and there were thuds on the roof, branches, debris, or who knew what else. I yelled for them to run to the bathtub. It was the only thing I could think of, remembering those tornado safety videos they showed at school. We ran down the narrow hallway, the flashlight beam bouncing while the floor seemed to move under our feet. Brandon helped Kayla climb in first, then crouched behind her. I was about to join them when the world flipped upside down. The floor vanished beneath my feet, and I felt myself flying sideways, slamming hard into the bathroom doorframe. The sound of metal tearing and glass exploding filled my ears as our home literally came apart around us. I managed to grab the edge of the bathtub just as everything went airborne. The next few seconds felt endless. I remember the weightless sensation, like being on a roller coaster that had suddenly come off the tracks. Then came the impact, a brutal slam that knocked the breath out of me. The trailer hit the ground on its side and then started rolling. I lost my grip on the tub and was thrown against what used to be the ceiling, now turned into a wall. Everything was chaos. Chunks of insulation falling, furniture sliding back and forth, the kids' screams. When it finally stopped, I was trapped under a part of the kitchen cabinet. Every breath burned in my ribs. Even so, I could hear Brandon sobbing nearby, calling for me through the wreckage. But Kayla wasn't making a sound. Gathering what strength I had, I shoved the cabinet off me and began crawling toward my son's voice. The flashlight was gone, but lightning flashing through the twisted window frames lit the disaster in bursts. Our home was unrecognizable. Walls collapsed, the roof torn away in pieces, and rain pouring relentlessly through the gaps. I found Brandon pinned between the overturned refrigerator and what was left of the hallway wall. His arm was bent at an unnatural angle, but he was still conscious, tears running down his dust-covered face. "Mom, I can't find Kayla," he kept repeating over and over, trembling. That's when I saw it. Part of the trailer's metal frame had collapsed, leaving a kind of crushed pocket right where the bathroom used to be. I crawled toward that space, screaming my daughter's name, though my voice was barely audible over the storm's roar. Through a slit in the twisted metal, I could make out her pink sneaker, the one with unicorn laces she had picked for her birthday. All the weight of the structure was resting on that section. I tried to lift the metal, push it, pull it, anything, but it didn't move an inch. My phone had to be smashed somewhere in the debris, and the nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived almost 5 kilometers away. I told Brandon to keep talking to his sister, to tell her anything, to tell her I was going to get help and I'd be back soon. He nodded through tears, reaching his good arm toward where his sister was trapped. I crawled to the opening where the living room window used to be and went out into the storm. The rain hit my face like needles, and the wind nearly knocked me down before I'd even taken 3 steps. The truck was gone, probably thrown somewhere into the cotton field. I started running down the dirt road, slipping and falling again and again. Every breath stabbed my chest. I could feel broken ribs with every movement. The road was covered with branches, scraps of metal, and twisted mailbox remains. Each lightning flash showed brief scenes of destruction. I kept running barefoot, my feet bleeding from cuts left by glass and nails. The image of that pink sneaker wouldn't leave my mind. It took me almost an hour to reach the Henderson farm. Their house was still standing, lights on, a warm glow that looked otherworldly under the rain. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting nonsense about my kids, the trailer, that I needed help, that it had to be right now. Please, God, now. Mr. Henderson called 911 while his wife wrapped me in a blanket, but the operator said all emergency units were busy. The tornado had devastated 3 entire counties. It would take at least an hour to reach our area. Without wasting time, the Hendersons drove me back. She drove the truck while her husband followed with tools, ropes, anything that might help. The whole way I prayed nonstop, making promises to God, begging for a miracle, asking only that my little girl still be alive. When we got back, Brandon was still there, still talking to his sister among the trailer wreckage, his voice raw from calling her name. Mr. Henderson did everything he could. He used a hydraulic jack, pry bars, even tried hooking a chain to his truck to lift the frame. But the metal only groaned and shifted slightly, refusing to give. I squeezed through the gap and managed to take Kayla's hand. It was cold, cold as ice, despite the suffocating August heat. I held her hand and sang her favorite song, that lullaby about the mockingbird and diamond rings. We stayed like that until the paramedics finally arrived, 2 hours and 17 minutes after the tornado. They brought hydraulic equipment and managed to lift the frame, but it was already too late. They tried to revive her, unsuccessfully. My little girl had been gone for a long time. 3 days later, while I was with Brandon at the hospital, a reporter showed up to ask questions about the storm. That was when I learned that the emergency siren for our area, installed on a tower a little over 3 kilometers from the trailer, had been out of service for 13 months. The county knew, but hadn't allocated funds to repair it. If that alarm had sounded, if we'd had even 5 minutes of warning, maybe I could have taken my kids to old Watson's shelter, just a few blocks away. Maybe Kayla would still be drawing her horses. The county commissioner sent me a condolence letter along with a promise that they would repair all damaged sirens immediately. I still have that letter. Sometimes I take it out and stare at it for long minutes. It's full of empty words. Words that came too late to save my little girl. Story 2. Even today, I can't drive past a dairy farm without remembering what happened to my college friend, Jake Sullivan. It was the summer of 2015, right after we finished our second year at the University of Madison. While I went back to Milwaukee to help at my father's hardware store, Jake decided to stay in Wisconsin to work at the Brennan Dairy Farm near Sheboygan. He was 20, studying agricultural sciences, and eager to get real, hands-on experience. I remember helping him move into the small apartment above the farm's machinery shed. Mr. Brennan, the owner, was an older man, around 70, with a sun-weathered face and a slight limp. He seemed genuinely grateful to have a young person willing to work. The farm wasn't huge, about 80 head of cattle, but with just him and one full-time employee named Carl, it was obvious they had more work than they could handle. Jake was thrilled with his new job. During the first week, he texted me constantly, excitedly telling me how he'd learned to milk cows and operate the equipment. The last time I saw him alive was 2 weeks after he started. I went to visit him on a Saturday afternoon. He was euphoric, determined to impress Mr. Brennan. We went to a local bar for a few beers, and the whole time he talked about how badly he wanted to prove he wasn't just another soft college kid. In the middle of the conversation, he mentioned a concrete hatch near the main barn that everyone avoided. It was some kind of underground manure storage tank. Carl had warned him not to go near it, saying it hadn't been cleaned in years. But Jake had that look in his eyes, the same one he got before doing something reckless, like when he climbed the bell tower during our freshman year. I bet if I offer to clean that tank, Brennan will be impressed, he said, finishing his third beer. I told him it sounded dangerous, that if nobody went near it, there had to be a good reason. He just laughed and changed the subject, starting to talk about a girl from his soil science class. 3 days later, on Tuesday morning, he called me around 7:30. He sounded excited. He told me he had just volunteered to clean out the manure pit and that Mr. Brennan had looked surprised and grateful. Carl tried to talk me out of it, he said, but Brennan got me some old overalls and rubber boots from the storage room. As he talked, I could hear his footsteps, probably heading toward the barn. I had a bad feeling and told him to wait, to at least look up safety measures before doing it. But Jake had already made up his mind. He explained that the tank hadn't been emptied in almost 3 years because Brennan couldn't afford the specialized crew that usually handled it. How dangerous can it be? I'll just climb down, scoop out what I can reach, and come right back up, he told me, like it was nothing. That casual tone chilled my blood, and tragically I later learned what it really meant. From later reports and articles, I found out Jake had no idea what kind of danger he was walking into. Manure tanks on dairy farms are underground concrete reservoirs where waste collects, feces, urine, and wash water. As it decomposes, it produces extremely toxic gases: hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and methane. Methane is especially deadly because it has no smell and displaces oxygen. In an enclosed space, its concentration can become lethal in a matter of minutes. Cleaning one of those tanks requires specialized mechanical ventilation, gas detectors, and usually supplied air respirators. Some farms even use remotely controlled machinery so a person doesn't have to enter. But Jake didn't know any of that, and apparently Mr. Brennan didn't either. Or if he did, he didn't say so. The old man simply handed him the boots and overalls, maybe told him to hold his breath, and allowed a 20-year-old to climb down a rusted ladder into what was, quite literally, a death trap. Carl later said he was in the milking parlor when he heard Brennan shouting Jake's name over and over. When he ran to the tank, he saw the old man standing by the opening, looking down and yelling in desperation. Jake had been down for barely 5 minutes when there was a splash, and then absolute silence. The pit was about 4 meters deep and almost 2.5 meters wide, with 3 years of liquid manure accumulated halfway up. Carl tried to climb down to rescue him, but the smell hit him like an invisible wall. It wasn't just the stench of manure. It was a chemical, suffocating air that burned his lungs. He only got down 2 rungs before his vision blurred and he had to scramble back up, gasping for clean air. Mr. Brennan was already on the phone with 911, but the nearest confined space rescue team was 45 minutes away. According to the coroner's report, Jake lost consciousness within the first 2 or 3 minutes after entering the pit. The methane concentration measured at the bottom was over 300,000 parts per million, when anything over 50,000 is already considered a deadly level. He probably felt dizzy, tried to climb out, but his muscles wouldn't respond anymore. The hydrogen sulfide would have burned his throat and eyes, and the lack of oxygen would have disoriented him until he fell. Even if he managed to stay afloat, every breath he took was pure poison. The volunteer firefighters who arrived first couldn't do anything but wait for the specialized team. One of them, Kevin, who had gone to the same high school as Jake, told me afterward that they could see Jake's body floating face down in the mixture, his bright blue shirt visible in the beam of their flashlights. They tried lowering a rope, hoping he might grab it, but everyone knew it was already pointless. When the rescue team arrived with respirators and ventilation fans, it took them another hour to set everything up to recover his body without exposing themselves to the gas. Carl told them he had tried to stop him, and the firefighters began questioning Brennan about safety equipment and ventilation systems. The old man just kept repeating that he'd never had problems before, that his father built that pit in the 1960s, and that they had always held their breath when they needed to check it. He seemed genuinely shocked that the gases could kill so quickly. But 2 days later, OSHA investigators discovered something decisive. By law, every manure pit above a certain size had been required to have exhaust fans since 2008. Mr. Brennan had even received a warning letter 3 years earlier, with the exact system requirements and a deadline that had already passed. I attended every day of the trial that followed the tragedy. Brennan's lawyer argued that the old man didn't understand how severe the danger was, that he was barely keeping the farm afloat financially, and that he couldn't afford the ventilation system. I'm priced at $10,000. They brought witnesses who talked about his generosity, how he donated milk to food banks and helped neighbors during hard times. But the prosecutor had Jake's parents there every day. He also showed photos. Jake at his high school graduation, on move-in day at the dorm, holding his little nephew at Christmas. The prosecutor presented to the jury the signed document in which Brennan acknowledged receiving OSHA's warning letter, proof he knew exactly what he was supposed to do and chose to ignore it. They also presented evidence that 6 months after receiving that letter, Brennan bought a new truck for $15,000 while telling inspectors he didn't have the money to install the safety system. The jury took less than 3 hours to find him guilty of criminally negligent homicide. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he served only 2 before being released for health reasons. The farm was sold to cover the settlement with Jake's family. Carl, the other worker, found a job at another dairy farm farther north near Green Bay, this time somewhere with proper safety protocols. Sometimes I drive past where the Brennan farm used to be. Now there's a housing development there. Small ranch-style homes with neat lawns where cows once grazed. There's no trace left of the barn or the concrete hatch that became Jake's grave. But I know exactly where it was. I could find it with my eyes closed. Jake's parents created a scholarship in his name at the University of Madison, dedicated to agricultural safety education. Every year, the recipients have to take a special course on confined space hazards on farms. His mother once told me, if even a single young person learns to question unsafe practices, to refuse to do something dangerous, then Jake's death will have meant something. Sometimes I have nightmares about that call. I hear his excited voice telling me his plan to clean the pit. In my dreams, I manage to convince him not to do it, or I drive there and stop him before he goes down that ladder. But I always wake up in the same reality. My best friend died at 20, suffocated in a pit full of manure, because an old man believed he knew better than safety regulations. The worst part is how preventable it was. A proper ventilation system, a gas detector, or even a simple fan would have saved his life. Carl told me later that when the rescue team finished ventilating and emptying the pit, they found Jake's phone at the bottom, cracked, but still powered on. His last outgoing call had been to me that morning, telling me his big plan to impress the boss. There were 16 missed calls after that. Mine, his parents, his girlfriends, all made when he was already dead, floating in that toxic darkness. What haunts me most is that Jake didn't die because he was being reckless, but because he was trying to help. He wasn't trying to show off or break rules. He genuinely believed he was doing something good, something that would prove his worth. He just wanted to show he was more than a student playing farmer for the summer. In his agricultural safety classes, they talked about machinery, chemicals, and livestock handling, but nobody warned them about manure tanks. And I wonder how many more young people are out there, willing to prove themselves, not knowing they're one mistake away from losing everything. After the trial, Jake's father gave me a box of his belongings from the apartment above the shed. Inside were his textbooks, still marked in chapters about soil management, and his notebook filled with notes about the farm's day-to-day operations, barn sketches, feeding schedules, meticulous notes. On the last page, dated the morning he died, he had written, "Ask Mr. Brennan about winter preparation for the manure system. Offer to help." I graduated the following year and ended up working for an agricultural safety consulting firm. It wasn't the path I had planned, but after what happened to Jake, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. Part of my job is inspecting dairy operations, and I've lost count of how many pits like the one that killed Jake I've seen. No ventilation, no detectors, no warning signs. Just a concrete hatch and decades of "this is how we've always done it." Some farmers get defensive when I explain the regulations. They say they've survived without those expensive systems for years. That's when I pull out a photo of Jake, tell them about the students who now learn in his name, about his parents who still can't cross Wisconsin without crying. Most of the time, that changes their attitude. The ones who don't listen, I report directly to OSHA. I don't care if it costs them money or if I make enemies. Jake won't get a second chance. But maybe, thanks to an installed fan, to a rule finally enforced, another young person will. Because sometimes, rules are written in blood. Story 3. Living on a 40-acre property in rural Kansas taught me a lot about what it means to be self-sufficient. 4 years ago, when my husband Greg and I bought the property outside Topeka, we felt like we had found a treasure. The previous owners had left a real collection of farm equipment in the old red barn. Tractors, plows, seeders, tools we had absolutely no idea how to use. We had a few chickens and a couple of horses, but we were not farmers in any sense. Greg worked in the insurance industry and usually traveled 3 to 4 days a week visiting clients all over the Midwest. I ran my graphic design business from home, enjoying the peace that country life offered. Our nearest neighbor lived almost a kilometer down the gravel road, and we loved that. That early April morning started like any other. Greg left before dawn for a conference in Oklahoma City, after kissing my forehead while I pretended to keep sleeping. Around 9, I decided, finally, to tackle a job I'd been putting off for months, cleaning out the barn and getting rid of some of that old equipment that did nothing but collect dust. With spring cleaning energy in full force, I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures. The John Deere seeder looked ancient, but still solid. The disc plow was in decent shape, and the cultivator had definitely seen better days. I posted everything on Facebook Marketplace at reasonable prices. I wasn't trying to get rich, just to free up space. In less than an hour, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from interested buyers. Most were ridiculous offers, people asking for impossible discounts, others wanting me to deliver the items 2 hours away, or proposing useless trades. But one message caught my attention. A man named Robert said he and his brother were starting a small farm near Salina, an hour to the west. They were interested in the seeder and the cultivator, willing to pay full price, in cash. They asked if they could come by that same afternoon, around 3. His profile looked legitimate, a middle-aged man with family photos, an active account since 2014. I told him 3 o'clock was perfect. He immediately confirmed and asked for the address, saying they'd be arriving in a white Ford F-250 with a trailer. They sounded polite, professional, exactly the kind of buyers you hope to find online. Around 2:45, my dogs, Max and Bella, 2 German shepherds, started barking earlier than expected. They always announced visitors long before anyone reached the door. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a white truck creeping slowly up our long driveway, leaving a trail of dust behind it. The trailer was large, suitable for hauling equipment. 2 men got out of the truck, one tall and thin, wearing a worn Carhartt jacket, and the other shorter and stockier, in a baseball cap. The tall one waved as he walked toward the porch, and I noticed he had a slight limp. The shorter one stayed by the vehicle, lighting a cigarette. His body language seemed tense, but I chalked it up to travel fatigue. "You must be Robert," I said as I stepped onto the porch. The man nodded without offering his hand. "That's right. This is my brother. Dale," he added, pointing to the other man, who barely lifted his head in greeting. "Nice property you've got here. Very quiet," Robert commented, though his eyes weren't on the landscape, but on the house windows, the driveway entrance, and the surrounding fields. I felt a small knot of unease, but I dismissed it immediately. City girl paranoia, I told myself. They were just country guys taking in the place. "The equipment's in the barn," I said. pointing to the red building about 50 meters from the house. "Want to go take a look?" Robert nodded, and Dale flicked his cigarette into the gravel before following us. Inside the barn, it felt cooler. The familiar smell of old hay and motor oil hung in the air. Beams of light cut through the cracks in the wooden boards, illuminating dust floating in the space. We passed the stalls where our two mares, Penny and Sugar, watched us with curiosity. The equipment was in the back, covered with tarps I'd pulled off that morning for the photos. "Here's the cedar," I started to say, but I noticed Robert had stopped. He positioned himself between me and the side door we'd come in through, while Dale moved to my other side. The atmosphere changed instantly, like the air before a storm. Dale slipped his hand into his jacket and I saw a metallic flash, a folding knife he snapped open with a quick, confident motion. "This is how it's going to go," Robert said, his tone completely different now, hard and icy. "You're going to give us the car keys and all the money you have in the house. Then we're going to take a little walk out there. No stupid stuff. Stay calm." Time seemed to slow down as my mind desperately searched for a way out. The main barn doors were padlocked from the outside. I had done that myself that morning. The only exit was the side door, now blocked, or the narrow passage between the stalls that led to the outdoor pen. It was about 5 meters away, but Dale stepped directly into my path, the knife glinting in the light. "I don't keep cash here," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "And the car keys are in the house. I can go get them." Robert let out a harsh laugh that echoed through the rafters. "Nice try, sweetheart. We're all going together. Dale, grab her." The moment the guy took a step toward me, I did the only thing I could think of. I ducked and drove my shoulder forward. I slammed into his abdomen with all my strength, like when I played hockey in high school. The hit knocked him backward into a pile of old fence posts, and his knife fell to the ground. I didn't wait to see if he got up. I ran straight toward the stalls as I heard Robert shouting behind me. I vaulted the half door into Penny's pen, and she startled and backed away. I landed in the soft straw, twisting my ankle a little, but the adrenaline pushed me forward. I squeezed through the tight space between the stalls and slid through the opening to the outside, scraping my arms on the wood. Once I was out, I shoved the sliding bolt on the door from the outside and locked it in place. Then I did the same with the latch on the corral. I had them trapped. My whole body was shaking as I backed away, hearing pounding from inside the barn and the muffled shouts of the men. I sprinted toward the house faster than I'd ever run in my life. My hands wouldn't cooperate as I tried to yank my phone out of my pocket. It took 3 tries to unlock the screen and dial 911. 911, what is your emergency? A calm voice answered, surreal against the chaos in my chest. 2 men tried to rob me. They're locked in my barn. They had a knife. I gasped, giving the address between breaths. Are you safe now, ma'am? Are you inside the house? Yes, I'm inside. I locked the door. They came pretending to buy farm equipment. From the kitchen window, I could still see their white truck sitting at the end of the driveway. Officers are on the way. Stay on the line with me, the operator said. I ran to the hallway closet and grabbed Greg's shotgun, checking that it was loaded, though I'd only used it once at the shooting range. The next 20 minutes felt endless. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, the gun across my legs, the phone pressed to my ear. The operator kept talking to me, asking for descriptions, vehicle details, what had happened. I could still hear occasional pounding from the barn, though it grew weaker each time. I was terrified they'd find a way out, that some old board would give. I couldn't stop thinking about the knife, and how naturally Dale had opened it, like he'd done it many times before. When I finally heard sirens in the distance, I started crying, not from fear, but from relief. 3 sheriff's patrol cars came up the drive through a cloud of dust. I set the shotgun on the counter and went outside to meet them, my legs shaking. "They're in the barn," I managed to say, pointing. I locked them in through the stall door. The deputies approached the barn with their weapons drawn, ordering them to come out with their hands visible. There was a moment of silence, and then Robert's voice, pretending calm. "Officers, this is a misunderstanding. This crazy woman locked us in here for no reason." One deputy stayed with me while the others surrounded the building. Eventually, they brought both men out, handcuffed and looking very different. Dale had a dark bruise on his ribs, and Robert's fake friendliness was completely gone. Officer Torres, who led the response, took my full statement. "You did exactly the right thing," she told me. "You were very smart to use the stall door." Then she gave me news that took my breath away. "We ran the plates on the way here. The truck was reported stolen in Wichita 2 days ago." The later investigation revealed something even more terrifying. Robert and Dale, those weren't their real names, were serial predators. They had been operating across Kansas for months, targeting women selling livestock or farm equipment online, showing up when they knew the women would be alone. I was the 5th woman they approached, but the first to escape and get them arrested. The others had been robbed, and one of them badly injured for resisting. In their truck, officers found detailed notes with the names and addresses of future victims. I had to testify at the trial 8 months later, reliving every second of that afternoon. Both were sentenced to between 15 and 20 years in prison. Greg installed security cameras the following week, and we adopted a 3rd German Shepherd. I still sell things online, but never when I'm alone, and I always meet buyers in the county police station parking lot. Some people will say that's paranoia. I call it learning from experience. Story 4. Working the peach harvest in southern Georgia wasn't my first choice for the summer of 2023, but after losing my construction job in March, I took whatever work came up. The Garrison family farm outside Valdosta promised steady pay through September and housing in the worker barracks. When I arrived in late July, the heat hit me like a physical wall. That thick, sticky Georgia humidity that makes your clothes cling to your skin before you even start working. The barracks weren't much, converted shipping containers, with bunks and window air conditioners that barely managed to bring the temperature down. I shared my container with 5 other men, including Miguel, a quiet Guatemalan who had returned to the same farm 3 seasons in a row. He spoke little, sent money to his wife and kids, but he was the one who taught me how to spot the trees with the ripest fruit and how to avoid the fire ants that built their mounds between the rows. The foreman, Donovan, a bony man with sun-leathered skin and pale blue eyes, ran the harvest operation with almost military precision. He had been with the Garrisons for more than a decade and lived in a double-wide trailer at the edge of the property. There was something about him that made everyone nervous. Maybe the way he would suddenly appear between the trees when you least expected it, or how he deducted pay for bruised fruit even when it wasn't your fault. Miguel warned me on the first day to keep my head down when Donovan was around. He said Donovan had a temper that could blow like a summer storm. The other workers had their own stories about Donovan's mood swings, whispers in Spanish that died the moment he walked by. Still, if you hit your quota, the money wasn't bad, and I figured I could put up with a difficult boss for a few months. Looking back, I should have paid attention to how even the veterans tensed up when Donovan's white Ford Ranger bounced along the dirt roads between the orchards. Everything changed on a Thursday morning in early August, when Miguel didn't show up for the 5 a.m. transport to the orchards. His bunk was empty, the sheets pulled tight like he'd made the bed, but his boots were still under it and his phone charger hung from the outlet. The night before, I'd heard him arguing with Donovan near the tool shed. From my window, I couldn't make out the words, but Miguel's voice had that sharp edge it got when something outraged him. For days he had been complaining that his paychecks were short, that Donovan was shaving hours off everyone's time cards. Most of us had noticed it, but we stayed quiet out of fear of losing the job. Miguel had 3 years of perfect attendance at the farm, and maybe he thought that counted for something. When I mentioned the empty bunk, my roommates exchanged uneasy looks. Luis, the one who'd worked with Miguel the longest, shook his head and muttered that maybe he'd gotten a ride into town. Maybe he'd left early. By lunchtime, everyone was talking about Miguel's absence. Donovan marched through the orchards with his clipboard, marking him absent and telling anyone who'd listen that people who run off don't get their final check. But Miguel wasn't the type to run off. He had a photo of his family taped above his bunk and called every Sunday without fail. During the water break, I texted him. The messages showed as delivered, never read. That afternoon, the heat felt worse, and not just because of the sun. People kept glancing toward the equipment shed where Miguel had argued with the Donovan, and conversations died whenever the foreman walked past. Around 3 p.m., I noticed Donovan's truck had fresh mud on the tires and scratches along the passenger side, like it had pushed through the thick brush that separates the orchards from the swampy areas. When he caught me looking, he held my gaze with those pale eyes until I went back to work. That night, Miguel's cousin, Antonio, showed up from the neighboring farm, asking if anyone had seen him. The expression on his face when we showed him Miguel's things still there tightened my chest with worry. The next few days blurred into suspicion and fear. We started moving in groups. Nobody wanted to be alone in the far sections of the orchard, and productivity dropped so much Donovan wouldn't stop yelling about quotas. On Sunday morning, another man vanished. Hector, a young Honduran who had only been on the farm for 2 weeks. This time there were witnesses. Pablo and Ernesto saw him walk toward the tool shed around 9 p.m. the night before. They said Donovan had called him over to talk about documentation issues. Hector never returned to the barracks. His things were still there, wallet included, with a bus ticket home dated for the following month. That's when the whispers turned into real planning. The older men, workers who'd already seen too much, started organizing. They made calls to other farms, to legal aid groups, to anyone who would listen. The word strike began to pass from bunk to bunk like a secret prayer. Monday morning arrived with a crimson dawn that painted the peaches the color of dried blood. When Donovan came with his clipboard for the count, he found all 43 workers standing in front of the barracks, arms crossed, nobody moving toward the trucks. Luis stepped forward as spokesperson, his face weathered and set. He demanded to know where Miguel and Hector were and said no one was going to pick another peach until they got answers. Donovan's face cycled through shades of red before settling into a dangerous purple. He threatened to call immigration, to blacklist us at other farms, to throw us off the property before noon. But Luis held firm, and we stood behind him. The sit-in lasted 2 hours, with Donovan making calls and pacing like a caged animal. Finally, old man Garrison himself showed up in his Lincoln Continental, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. After a heated argument with Donovan, none of which we could hear, Garrison announced he would call the sheriff to report missing persons. The relief among us was palpable, but I saw Donovan's expression. It wasn't anger anymore. It was calculation, like he was solving a problem. Sheriff's deputies arrived in less than an hour. 2 cruisers that split up to interview people and search the property. Most of us could only provide the disappearance timelines, but I made sure to mention the argument between Miguel and Donovan, the damage on the truck, everything I'd noticed. The deputy who took my statement, a young woman with a serious gaze, wrote down every detail, though she didn't seem especially alarmed. "Standard procedure," she said. "These things usually sort themselves out." Around 2 p.m., shouting erupted from the edge of the orchard where the tree line began. Through the rows, I could see deputies running, radios crackling urgently. Word spread through the workers like fire. They'd found something. We crowded near the police tape as they started putting it up, close enough to see officers photographing a patch of disturbed ground near a drainage ditch. The smell hit us when the wind shifted, sweet and wrong. Nothing like the honest rot of fallen fruit. Louise squeezed my shoulder hard, and I knew without anyone telling me what was there. The excavation took hours, but we couldn't leave. We couldn't look away. When they finally pulled out the body wrapped in a blue tarp, Antonio made a sound I will never forget. Half sob, half howl. Even from far away, you could make out the Guatemala national team shirt Miguel wore every Sunday. The sheriff cordoned off the orchard as a crime scene. More units arrived, state police and forensic teams. Donovan was gone. His trailer was empty, his truck missing. He'd vanished into the humid Georgia air. Garrison stood beside his Lincoln, his face gray, repeating to anyone who'd listened that Donovan had worked for his family for 12 years, that there had to be a mistake. Then Cesar remembered something. The year before, the farm had installed trail cameras to catch whoever was stealing equipment. Cesar had helped set them up and knew where they were. One near the tool shed, another by the orchard's main road. Investigators rushed to check the memory cards, leaving us under the brutal sun trying to process what was happening. They moved us into the dining hall while they watched the footage. Deputies took statements and contact information from every worker. Through the windows, we saw more investigators arrive, some in suits despite the heat. Around 5 p.m., a detective came in and asked for those of us who'd shared a container with Miguel. His questions were detailed. When we last saw him, what condition he was in, whether Donovan had threatened him before. Then he asked something that froze my blood. Whether anyone had recently seen Donovan driving through the orchards at night. Several hands went up. Tomas talked about headlights moving between the trees at midnight 3 nights earlier. Horita mentioned hearing an engine revving near the shed while everyone slept. The detective kept his face neutral, but exchanged a look with his partner. He thanked us and told us not to leave. There might be more questions. The news came at sundown, staining the sky the color of overripe peaches. The lead detective gathered us outside the dining hall, grim-faced. They had found footage from the night Miguel disappeared. The camera on the main road caught something at 11:47 p.m. Miguel running between the rows, stumbling, looking back over his shoulder. Seconds later, headlights, the white Ford Ranger, pushing between the trees, closing the distance. That's where the video cut out. The card filled up, but it was enough. They issued an arrest warrant and an APB in 3 states. The detective wouldn't tell us more about the condition Miguel had been found in, only that the medical examiner would determine the cause of death. But Pablo, who helped load the body into the medical examiner's vehicle, later whispered that he saw bruises, signs of violence that turned his stomach. We understood then that Miguel hadn't just died. He'd been hunted through those trees like an animal, run down by the man who was supposed to manage a harvest, not harvest lives. That night nobody slept. We sat outside the barracks in small groups, sharing cigarettes and memories of Miguel. wondering about Hector and whether they would find him too. State police brought dogs and ground-penetrating radar, turning the farm into a search grid. Around 3 a.m., they found Hector's body in a well in an abandoned section, weighed down with concrete blocks. The detective would later tell us he had the same injury pattern, evidence of being struck by a vehicle. By dawn, the farm was swarming with federal investigators. News vans lined the county road and helicopters thundered overhead. Garrison already had lawyers at his side, claiming total ignorance of his foreman's actions. But more stories began to surface. Workers from previous seasons came forward to talk about missing people, Donovan's threats, withheld wages, and veiled violence. Luis talked about a Haitian worker from 2021 who vanished after complaining about pay. Another from 2020 who supposedly went home in the middle of the night. The scale of what might have been happening on that farm for years was overwhelming. They caught Donovan 3 days later at a truck stop in Alabama, sleeping in his Ford Ranger, with dried blood still on the front bumper and Miguel's wallet in the glove compartment. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that Miguel had attacked him first and Hector had tried to steal from the farm. But the evidence said otherwise, a pattern of violence against workers who challenged him, who demanded fair pay, who threatened his small kingdom of fear. The trial became national news, even more so when they expanded the search and found 3 more bodies on the property. Workers from earlier years that nobody had reported missing because who was going to listen when undocumented immigrants vanished from farms? In the end, Donovan received life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the Garrison farm was permanently shut down. I left Georgia after giving my testimony, and I drove straight to my sister's house in Ohio without stopping. Sometimes I still dream about those peach trees and the sound of Miguel running through them in the dark. I went back to construction work, and whenever younger guys talk about easy money-picking fruit in the South, I tell them this story. I tell them about Miguel, who just wanted to be paid what he was owed, about Hector, who was only 22, and about everyone else whose names we may never know. And I tell them to be careful who they trust with their lives, because sometimes the real harvest is something far darker than fruit. Story 5. The afternoon stretched lazily over our property in Montana, 300 acres of wheat and pasture land that had been in my family for 4 generations. I was 15 that August, skinny and sunburned from helping with the harvest, counting the days until school started. My friend Allison lived on the neighboring ranch, 2 miles away as the crow flies, but almost 4 if you took the dirt roads. That Saturday, my parents had gone to Billings to buy supplies, leaving me a list of chores and the promise that I could visit Allison once I finished everything. I washed the dishes, fed the chickens, and by 2 o'clock I was tying my hiking boots, ready to take the shortcut through the woods that separated our properties. My grandfather had died 3 winters earlier, leaving behind a workshop full of rusty tools and hunting gear that nobody had bothered to sort through. In his youth, he'd been a trapper, back when pelts paid well and nobody questioned the methods. In the end, with dementia, he wandered the property at night, setting snares and animal traps for creatures that hadn't lived there in decades. We thought that after his death, we'd found all his equipment. We believed we'd removed the dangerous stuff. My father spent an entire weekend taking wire snares off fence posts and collecting small game traps around the barn. But our land was enormous, with forgotten corners where the forest grew thick and wild, stretches we rarely entered. The shortcut through the woods saved me almost an hour of walking. I'd taken it dozens of times, following a deer trail that wound between towering ponderosa pines and crossed a clearing where wildflowers burst in purples and yellows under the summer sun. In places, the path was overgrown. Branches snagged my tank top and scratched my arms, but I knew every turn. Halfway there, the trail dropped into a shallow ditch where a stream ran that had dried up years ago. The ground stayed damp there even in August, moss clinging to rocks and ferns growing in dense clumps. I hopped down the small embankment. My boots squelched in the mud and I hummed a pop song that had been stuck in my head all day. The steel teeth bit into my ankle before I even registered that I'd stepped on something wrong. Pain hit like lightning, shooting up my leg and stealing the air from my lungs. I crashed down hard, twisted my knee, my hands clawing at the dirt. When I tried to jerk free, the trap clamped tighter, those rusted jaws biting deeper into flesh and tendon. It was a massive contraption, far bigger than any rabbit or fox trap. This was made for bears or wolves, creatures that hadn't roamed those lands freely since my grandfather was young. The chain disappeared into the ground, anchored to something deep beneath the soil. Blood was already pooling inside my boot, warm and sticky, darkening the brown leather. For the first few minutes, all I did was scream. Not for help. I knew no one would hear me out there, but from raw animal panic. I fumbled for the trap's mechanism, trying to pry the jaws apart, but the springs were too strong and the rust had fused parts together. Every movement triggered fresh waves of agony. The metal had cut through muscle, and I could feel it scraping bone when I shifted even slightly. My phone was useless on the dresser in my bedroom. I'd forgotten it that morning. Allison wouldn't worry when I didn't show up. She'd assume my parents had changed their minds. They wouldn't be back until after dark, maybe 8 or 9, if they stopped for dinner like they often did. The sun crossed the sky with cruel slowness. I tried everything, using sticks as levers, digging with bare hands at the chain's anchor point until my nails tore and bled, even trying to pull my foot out of the boot. Nothing worked. The trap stayed immovable, its teeth sunk too deep, and each attempt left me weaker and dizzier from blood loss. As evening fell, the temperature dropped the way it does in Montana, from scorching heat to teeth-chattering cold as soon as the sun touched the mountains. I was wearing shorts and a tank top, perfect for the afternoon, useless for spending a night in the woods. The ditch that had felt pleasant earlier turned into a pit, its walls too steep to climb, even if I hadn't been chained to the ground. The first wolf appeared just after sunset, a shadow moving between the trees above the ditch, then another and another. They didn't come close at first. They circled the rim, their eyes catching the last thread of light like yellow coins. I'd seen wolves before. They'd been reintroduced to the area years ago, sometimes from the truck, but never this close. Never while I was injured and alone. They could smell the blood. I knew that much. And they could probably sense how weak I was becoming. I gathered every stone within reach, piling them beside me like ammunition. When one climbed down into the ditch, about 20 feet away, I threw a rock with all my strength. It yelped and scrambled back up, but they didn't leave. They kept circling, waiting, with infinite patience. The night in that forest was darker than anything I'd ever experienced. No street lights, no house lights, just the faint glow of stars filtered through the pine canopy. The cold sank into my bones, and I started shivering uncontrollably, which made the trap grind deeper into my ankle. I heard things moving in the darkness, not just the wolves, small creatures in the brush, owls calling from the branches. Every sound made me grip my dwindling pile of rocks tighter. Sometimes the wolves howled, long mournful cries that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I tried to stay awake, terrified of what would happen if I passed out. but blood loss and exhaustion dragged me towards sleep. I would jolt awake with shining eyes closer than before. I'd throw another rock, hoarsely screaming, to drive them back again. Dawn came slowly, from black to deep purple and then to a pale gray. The wolves vanished with the night, leaving only their tracks in the mud around me. My ankle was grotesquely swollen, the skin purple and black where the trap's teeth held it. The pain had become something else, a constant pounding that made it hard to think. But I knew I had to move. My parents would be awake, would find my bed empty, and would start searching. I needed to get closer to where they could see me. Using a thick branch as a crutch, I began the horrific process of dragging myself and hauling the trap up the ditch wall. The chain, only about 6 feet long, went taut almost immediately, so I'd crawl until it tightened and then dig and pull at the anchor, loosening it just enough to gain another foot or two. It took me 4 hours to cover what, under normal circumstances, would have been a 5-minute walk. 4 hours of crawling, dragging, stopping to vomit from pain, and forcing myself onward. The trap must have weighed 30 pounds. Every movement made it twist and yank at the shredded flesh of my ankle. I left a trail of blood through the ferns and moss, marking the path with broken branches and disturbed soil. When I finally reached the edge of the forest where our wheat field began, I could hear the distant engine of our truck. My vision darkened at the edges, but I pulled myself into the open field, under the morning sun, where they could see me. I remember my mother's scream cutting across the wheat. I remember my father running toward me, his face white with horror. And then, nothing. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, my left leg ending at the knee. The doctor said the trap had crushed too many bones, severed nerves, and infection had already set in. Despite their efforts, they needed specialized equipment just to remove the trap. Those old bear traps were designed to never let go, and this one had been welded shut by rust after decades underground. The wildlife officer who investigated found 14 more traps scattered across our property, some so deep only the chain was visible, all of them illegal. They had been for 50 years or more. Apparently, in his final years of confusion, my grandfather had created a minefield nobody knew about, setting traps in random places that only made sense to his fractured mind. The investigation made local news, warning other families to check their land for old devices. On 2 more farms in the county, they found similar dangers hidden in the woods. I spent months learning to walk with a prosthetic, and longer learning to trust the ground beneath my feet again. Even now, 10 years later, I can't walk through tall grass without looking down. I don't take a step where I can't see clearly. My parents sold the farm the following year. Too many memories, too much guilt. They still blame themselves for not checking every inch of those 300 acres. But honestly, who would think to look for bear traps in a place where bears hadn't lived for generations? Who expects a danger like that on their own land? Sometimes, the most terrifying things aren't strangers or monsters, but the forgotten dangers left behind by people we love, waiting in the dark for someone to stumble into them. Story 6. I grew up on a quiet stretch of farmland outside Spencer, Indiana. The kind of place where you can spend an entire afternoon hearing nothing but cicadas and, every so often, the low rumble of a truck rolling over the gravel. My father, Warren, had a small machinery repair shop on our property, and that's where that big old red tractor was, the one he'd bought second-hand from a neighbor. Most Saturdays I would hang around out there, sometimes sweeping, sometimes just watching. I remember that day the air was thick and humid, with a gray sky that threatened rain but never followed through. I was 10 years old, eager to be useful, looking for any way to prove to my dad I was more than just a tag-along. We were behind the shed, next to the cornfield, where the grass always grew a little taller than anywhere else. The tractor was giving him trouble, something about the hydraulic lift that wouldn't engage or lock. He'd raised it with one of those huge shop jacks and slid underneath with a socket wrench, muttering to himself the way he did when he was focused. I shifted from foot to foot, watching his boots sticking out from under the chassis. At some point he asked me for a tool from the open case beside me, something simple, a flathead screwdriver. I handed it to him, proud to help. While he kept working, I noticed the lift lever. I saw it was stiff, and I thought maybe I could help by pushing it a little so it would click into place. He hadn't told me to touch it. I assumed I was doing him a favor. I put both hands on the lever and gave it a shove. There was a hiss, like air escaping from a tire, and then a horrible mechanical groan as the lift started to lower. I didn't understand what was happening until I heard him scream. It wasn't a word. It was a raw, strangled sound that went straight through me. I panicked and tried to pull the lever back up, but it was stuck. I ran to the side and saw that the lift had come all the way down onto his torso. His legs kicked a few brief times and then stopped. I didn't know what to do. I started screaming for help, but we were too far from the house for anyone to hear us. I ended up running barefoot. I'd taken my shoes off earlier, through mud and gravel to the porch to grab the cordless phone. I dialed 911 with hands slick with sweat and grime. I couldn't think clearly. I just kept saying, "He's under the tractor. He's trapped. Please, send someone." The ambulance arrived fast, or at least faster than I thought was possible out there. I remember sitting on the steps, covered in dirt, my legs scratched by the tall grass, while 2 paramedics and a volunteer firefighter worked to raise the lift again. Dad was still breathing, but shallowly. His eyes were wide open, like he was staring at something that wasn't there. They spoke in short, precise phrases. Stabilize internal trauma. Get him to the hospital. Now. I couldn't stop staring at the deep groove the lift had left in his shirt. It didn't feel real that something so solid could mark a person like that. He survived the ride to the hospital and even the first night. The doctors told us he had multiple fractures and they were worried about bleeding they couldn't immediately locate. Mom stayed at his side, barely blinking, while I sat outside the room with a vending machine cocoa that went cold. Every few minutes, a nurse or a tech would pass and glance at me, like they didn't know whether I was family or a lost kid. I kept waiting for someone to scold me, to tell me what I'd done, but nobody did. The guilt was already moving through me like something alive. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. 3 days later, around noon, he was gone. They said it was a complication, something internal that suddenly ruptured. The word suddenly didn't fit. None of it felt sudden. It felt like something that had been waiting. I didn't go to the funeral. I stayed in the barn, in the far back corner where hay bales were stacked against the wall. I didn't come out until long after everyone had left. Mom didn't even come to get me. I think she knew I needed to be alone. I kept replaying everything in my head, what I touched, what I shouldn't have touched. It wasn't until almost a year later that I found the safety block. It was bright orange, with a chipped corner, and it was hidden behind a pile of old buckets in the barn. That block was supposed to always go under the lift as a precaution. My father never worked under a hydraulic system without using it. Never. And yet that day, it wasn't there. I don't know if he forgot it, if we were in a hurry, or if he assumed I had seen him place it. But it wasn't there. I stared at it for hours, like it was going to give me an answer. It only gave me silence, and maybe just a little less guilt. I didn't tell anyone right away. For years, I carried what happened like it was branded into my skin. Anytime someone mentioned my dad, even in passing, I would tense up, waiting for the story to come out. But nobody blamed me, at least not out loud. In town, like most people said, it had been a freak accident, a tragedy. One of those things you can't predict. But I knew the truth wasn't that clean. It lived in the gaps, like the fact that a 10-year-old shouldn't have been near a control lever, or that a safety block that was always used got forgotten that day. It changed me. I stopped going into the barn. I stopped hanging around the machines. I avoided that tractor like it had grown teeth. Eventually, Mom sold it to someone a few towns over. I didn't say goodbye to it. It might sound strange, but to me that machine had become something else. It didn't matter that it wasn't alive in my head. It had taken something from me. Seeing it made my chest tighten, like I was bracing for everything to go wrong again. Years later, when I was older, I finally told my uncle about the block. He'd worked with my father often and knew how meticulous he was. I expected him to tell me I was wrong, that the block must have been somewhere else, that I'd imagined it. But he just nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for me to say it. Warren didn't take shortcuts, he said, but even careful people miss something once in a while. It didn't erase anything, but it helped me redistribute the weight, to feel like maybe I wasn't the only reason that day went wrong. I still think about it, especially on quiet mornings when the sky looks like it did that day. Gray and full of promises it never keeps. I never went into machinery or repairs the way I once thought I might. I ended up working in a library, actually. Funny how life reroutes you and puts down roots somewhere else. I still carry pieces of that day, and I probably always will, but I've learned not to let it define me. I was a child who made a mistake, a terrible one, yes, but not a malicious one. And part of me, that stubborn, still childish part, keeps hoping my father knew that. Story 7. I didn't plan on going back to the farm. It was never part of my plans. Not even after the divorce. But when we signed the papers and the house sold faster than I expected, I needed somewhere stable, somewhere familiar. So I packed my Subaru with what was left of our life and drove my son Tyler back to the place I hadn't set foot in since 2009. The farm had been in the family for generations, about 20 minutes from a little town called Fairgrove, Missouri. It still smelled like dust and old wood, and the floorboards creaked in the exact same spots they had when I was a kid. We moved in mid-September, just before the first real cold snap, and tried to find some kind of rhythm. Tyler wasn't thrilled. He was 16 and used to sidewalks, gas stations, and staying out late with his friends. Here, the internet barely worked, and the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. But he tried, I'll give him that. In the evenings, we'd sit on the back porch, me with a cup of tea, him sometimes sullen with headphones on, watching the trees fade from green to gold. He helped me clean out the barn, carried boxes up to the attic, and even fixed the screen door after it slammed one too many times. It felt like maybe this place could give both of us room to breathe. That afternoon started like any other. I went into town to buy groceries and stopped by the post office. Tyler waved me off from the porch, wearing that oversized red long-sleeve hoodie and his headphones hanging around his neck. He said he might ride his bike down the old gravel trail behind the shed to kill time. I remember smiling and telling him to stay somewhere I could find him. The trip into town takes about 25 minutes each way, plus another 30 or so for errands. I wasn't gone more than 2 hours, but when I turned into the driveway, something felt wrong. The front door was standing wide open. At first, I thought maybe I'd left it that way by accident. Then I saw Tyler's bike lying on its side in the grass just beyond the porch steps, one pedal slowly turning, like it had been dropped seconds ago. There was also a half-finished bottle of root beer, condensation clinging to the plastic. I called his name, assuming he'd gone into the shed or walked toward the edge of the property, but there was no answer. Not from the shed, not from the barn, not from anywhere. I circled the house and then I saw them. Faint but unmistakable prints in the dirt. Deep, heavy tracks leading straight into the cornfield. The thing is, we hadn't planted corn in years. Not since my uncle died. What was left of the field was tall weeds and old stalks, some brittle and gray, others still standing, like they refused to give up. I followed the tracks, trying not to shout Tyler's name too loudly in case he was playing some kind of joke. But with every step, the silence squeezed tighter. No wind, no insects. Even the crows, which usually raised a racket at that hour, were quiet. All I heard was the dry crunch under my boots and my own breathing, growing more uneven. About 50 feet in, I saw something red among the stalks. For a second I thought it was blood, and my knees almost gave out. But when I pushed the plants aside, I saw it was Tyler's hoodie, crumpled on the ground like it had been torn off mid-run. Beside it was one of his headphones. The cord trailed away and was knotted, like it had been yanked out of his pocket. I called for him again, louder now, panic rising. Nothing. I kept going, following broken stalks and shredded leaves that curved deeper into the field. Then I found his phone. Cracked screen, still playing music through the other earbud that dangled. The volume was low, but audible. The timestamp said the song had only been playing for 7 minutes. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I was maybe 100 yards in when the air turned thicker, like it didn't want me there. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no obvious marks. But the way his things were scattered felt wrong. Too clean, too quiet. I turned around and couldn't see the house anymore. Only rows and rows of dead stalks. Then I heard it. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't a sound I could identify. It was more like breathing. Long, slow, steady. It was coming from ahead, but it wasn't human. Like someone exhaling through a throat that had forgotten how to do it. I didn't move. I stood there with Tyler's phone in one hand, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I heard something shift to my left. Not footsteps, something dragging, heavier than a person. I turned toward the noise, but all I saw were stalks barely swaying, like something had passed through them seconds before. That's when I finally reacted. I spun around and ran straight back the way I'd come, heart hammering, legs burning. The air felt colder now, the silence deeper, like the field itself was watching me leave. When I burst out of the cornfield, I expected to see Tyler on the porch, maybe laughing, maybe annoyed. But the yard was empty. The sun had dropped just behind the tree line, turning everything that deep orange that stretches shadows like they're reaching for something. I called 911 without thinking. The operator kept asking if he might have run away, if he'd ever done something like that before. I tried to stay calm, but even I could hear in my voice that I didn't believe this was a simple disappearance. Not after what I'd seen, not after that sound. The sheriff's deputies arrived about 20 minutes later, 2 cruisers kicking up gravel and dust. I told them everything. The hoodie, the headphones, the phone, the sound in the field. One of the deputies, a young guy, came back with me, following my route. We found the hoodie and the phone exactly where I'd said. The strange part was everything else. The footprints were completely gone. Even the broken stalks looked intact, like they'd never been touched. The path I'd forced open on the way out was closed again, as if the field had healed itself. The next morning they brought dogs. They picked up Tyler's scent near the porch, by the bike, and again where the hoodie was. Past that point, nothing. It was like he'd vanished between one row and the next. For 3 days the search continued. Drones, helicopters, volunteers combing woods and fields in every direction. They even brought thermal cameras. Nothing. No torn clothes. No body. No signs of a struggle. Just absence. Like the field had swallowed him whole. I stayed on the farm for 3 more weeks. Part of me kept expecting him to come up the steps one night like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat much. Sometimes I heard that breathing again, late at night, beyond the window. A slow, deliberate inhale, like it was tasting the air, looking for me. I left on a Monday. I locked the door, left the key under the doormat, and didn't look back. The house is still there, I think. I don't know. I can't make myself check. All I know is this. If you ever find yourself walking beside an old cornfield and everything suddenly goes silent, don't go in looking for anyone. You might not be the one who comes back.